Picture a building that held the memory of the entire ancient world. Picture halls lined with 1,000,000 scrolls, every myth, every map, every cure, every prayer, every equation that the human mind had ever set down in ink. Picture scholars walking its marble corridors in linen robes, arguing in Greek and Egyptian and Aramaic, measuring the circumference of the earth with sticks and shadows, dissecting the human eye, cataloging the stars, debating the nature of the soul. Picture a single institution that gathered under one roof the wisdom of Babylon, the poetry of Homer, the geometry of Egypt, the medicine of Hippocrates, the philosophy of Plato. And then picture it burning. Not once, not in a single heroic night of destruction, but slowly, across centuries, in a long agony of fire and riot and neglect, until the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled was nothing but ash and silence. Have you ever wondered what humanity knew 2,000 years ago that we have never recovered? Have you ever stood in a library and felt the weight of all those silent voices, every one of them a life's work, every one of them kept alive only because someone bothered to copy it out by hand? Now imagine that weight multiplied 1,000-fold, gathered into one place, and then imagine that place gone. The Library of Alexandria was not a building. It was a promise, a bet that civilization could defeat time itself by writing everything down, a wager that if every word ever set to ink were gathered into one place, then no idea would ever truly die. And for 600 years, it almost won. 600 years of scholars walking the same halls, reading the same scrolls, arguing the same questions, while empires rose and fell around them. 600 years of a single unbroken thread of curiosity, kept alive by kings and librarians and 1,000,000 anonymous scribes whose names we do not remember, whose hands we cannot picture, but without whom not one line of the ancient world would have reached us. And then, in a long, slow catastrophe that no single war or fire could explain, the thread snapped. The lamps went out one by one. The scribes set down their reed pens and did not come back, and the halls where scholars had argued filled with dust and silence and the smell of rotting papyrus. This is the story of how that promise was made and how it was broken. It is a story about fire, but it is also a story about something more dangerous than fire, about what happens when a civilization forgets why it ever cared. The story begins with a dead king and a dream. In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon at the age of 32, and the empire he had conquered in a decade of lightning collapsed into war among his generals. They carved it up like a carcass, each claiming a piece, and for 40 years the Greek world bled. One of those generals, a shrewd and cautious Macedonian named Ptolemy, seized the richest prize of all, Egypt. Ptolemy did not want to be a warlord. He had watched Alexander's harder men destroy themselves chasing a bigger throne, and he wanted no part of it. He wanted to build a dynasty, and he understood that a dynasty needs more than soldiers. It needs a capital, a cult, and a reason for the world to remember it. He chose as his capital a small coastal town on the Mediterranean, beside a protected harbor and a long, thin island that sheltered it from the open sea. He called it Alexandria. Why there? Because Ptolemy understood geography the way he understood soldiers. The harbor was the best on the Egyptian coast. The island of Pharos broke the waves before they reached the shore, and behind the city lay the Nile Delta, the granary of the ancient world, a network of canals and warehouses that could feed an empire. Alexandria was not built where a city happened to grow. It was built where the world had to pass through. It was Ptolemy's son, Ptolemy II, who turned that capital into the wonder of the Mediterranean. He built a lighthouse, the Pharos, so tall its fire could be seen 30 miles out at sea, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a tower of pale stone in 3 tapering stages that burned a flame at its summit and guided ships safely into the harbor for 1,600 years. He built palaces, gardens, temples, and a sprawling complex of lecture halls and dining rooms and gardens and shrines that he called the Mouseion, the seat of the muses. The Mouseion was not a museum in our sense. It was a research institute, a temple to the 9 goddesses of the arts and sciences, a place where scholars lived, ate, and argued at the king's expense, free to think, free to quarrel, free to be wrong in public so that the truth might be found. At its heart sat the library. The Ptolemies were determined that Alexandria should hold every book ever written. They sent agents to every port and book fair in the Mediterranean to buy scrolls. They ordered every ship that docked at Alexandria to surrender any books on board to be copied, and they kept the originals, returning fair copies to the owners, a practice so aggressive that travelers learned to hide their books if they wanted to keep them. They borrowed the official archives of Athens, the great state scrolls of the city, and forfeited a fortune in gold rather than give them back, because a library that held the archives of Athens held a piece of Athens itself. They brought in scholars from across the Greek world, men like Euclid, who laid the foundations of geometry, and Xenodotus, the first librarian, who edited Homer and invented the comma. By the time the dynasty was a few generations old, the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, and the name Alexandria had become a synonym for knowledge itself. A new empire was being built, not of stone and gold, but of papyrus and ink, and its reach would be longer than any army's march. Walk into the library, and you would not have entered a single building. You would have entered a complex, a labyrinth of halls and gardens and storerooms that spread across the palace quarter and into the city beyond. The main collection, the Great Library, sat within the palace precinct, beside the Mouseion, surrounded by gardens and colonnades where scholars strolled and argued in the shade of plane trees, their voices rising and falling as they fought over a reading or a theorem. A daughter collection, the Serapeum, stood in the city's southern quarter, housed in a vast temple of the god Serapis, a Greek-Egyptian hybrid deity the Ptolemies had invented to unite their two peoples, a god who wore the robes of a Greek and the crown of an Egyptian and answered prayers in both languages. Together, the two collections may have held between them 500,000 scrolls, perhaps more, although no one ever counted them all. A scroll was not a book in our sense. It was a long sheet of papyrus, rolled tight, written in columns, read by unrolling it slowly with one hand while rolling it up with the other, a physical act as much as a mental one. Each one had to be copied by hand, letter by letter, in a script called uncial, with no spaces between words, no punctuation, no index, no page numbers, nothing to help a reader find their place except memory and a steady finger. A single work of Aristotle could fill a dozen scrolls. Storing them required shelves, and the shelves of Alexandria were legendary. Readers spoke of long halls lined with wooden cabinets called armaria, each holding hundreds of scrolls, labeled in Greek and arranged by subject, the tags dangling from the rolls like leaves. There were halls of poetry, halls of history, halls of medicine, halls of astronomy, halls of rhetoric, halls of law. The catalog alone, written by a librarian named Callimachus, ran to 120 scrolls and listed every author, every title, every line count in the collection, a map of everything the ancient world had ever thought to write down. The work of the library was not only storage. It was scholarship. In its halls, Aristophanes of Byzantium invented the system of accents that Greek still uses today, the marks that tell a reader where to raise the voice and where to let it fall, the rhythm of an entire language preserved in 3 tiny strokes. Aristarchus of Samothrace edited Homer with such authority that his marginal notes still shape what we read, settling 1,000 quarrels about which line belonged to the poet and which to a later hand, arguing with the dead across 8 centuries and winning. Eratosthenes, the third librarian, read an account of a well in southern Egypt where the sun cast no shadow on the summer solstice, and from that single observation calculated the circumference of the earth to within a few hundred miles of the true figure, 2,000 years before anyone sailed around it. And he did it with nothing but a stick, a shadow, and a mind willing to trust the numbers even when the numbers told him the world was far, far larger than anyone dared imagine. Herophilus dissected the human body, possibly live, and identified the nerves, the liver, the ovaries, the brain, proving that the brain was the seat of thought and not the heart, a fact that would be forgotten and rediscovered and forgotten again across the centuries. Archimedes, the greatest mind of the ancient world, corresponded with Alexandria and sent his theorems there to be kept, trusting no other place in the world to guard them. The library was not a museum of the past. It was a machine for producing the future, a factory where the raw material of human curiosity was refined into something called science. And here's the strange thing. These men knew they were building something that could not last, that papyrus rots, and ink fades, and a single wet winter can turn a scroll to black paste. And they built it anyway. They copied and recopied the same texts, generation after generation, the same Homer, the same Hippocrates, the same Aristotle, because they understood that knowledge is not a thing you keep, it is a thing you keep alive, and the moment you stop feeding it, it dies. The library was not a vault. It was a living organism, and for 600 years it breathed. The first fire came in the year 48 BCE, and the hand that lit it belonged to Julius Caesar. Caesar had pursued his rival Pompey the Great to Egypt, and found Pompey already dead, murdered by the boy King Ptolemy XIII, his head pickled and presented to Caesar as a gift. Caesar stayed to settle the throne, took the young Queen Cleopatra as his ally and his lover, and found himself besieged in the palace quarter of Alexandria by the king's army, trapped in a city that did not want him there. To break the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, he set fire to the ships. The wind was against him. The blaze jumped from the burning hulls to the docks, from the docks to the warehouses on the shore, and from the warehouses to the buildings beyond, and no one could stop it. Ancient sources disagree on what burned. Some say the great library itself was destroyed in that night of fire. Others say only a warehouse full of scrolls near the harbor, books that had been seized from the ships and were waiting to be cataloged, an overflow collection that the librarians had not yet found room for. 500,000 scrolls, or 40,000, or none at all. The accounts contradict each other, and the truth is lost in the smoke of that night. What is certain is that a fire raged through the palace quarter that summer, that scrolls burned, and that the library, or a part of it, was wounded for the first time. You can almost hear the sound of it, the crackle of papyrus, the hiss of ink boiling off the page, the shouts of slaves trying to save what they could. The damage was repaired. The collection was rebuilt. Cleopatra, in her affair with Mark Antony, was accused of giving him 200,000 scrolls from the rival library of Pergamum as a gift, a story that may be slander, but it shows how much a library could mean as a gesture of power, a king's ransom given as a lover's token. After Caesar, the library limped on. The Roman emperors who inherited Egypt from Cleopatra's dead dynasty were not as generous as the Ptolemies had been. The Mouseion faded. The great lecture halls went quiet. The librarians stopped being the finest scholars of the Greek world and became functionaries, civil servants guarding a collection they no longer fully understood, men who knew where the scrolls were shelved but no longer knew what was in them. The budget for buying new scrolls dried up. The budget for copying old ones, the endless patient labor that kept a scroll from crumbling into dust as its papyrus aged and its ink faded, dried up with it. A papyrus scroll lasts at most 300 years in the damp of a Mediterranean climate before the fibers rot and the letters bleed into nothing. Without constant recopying, a library is dying from the day it is built, and the death is invisible because the shelves still look full, the tags still dangle, the cabinets still close, but inside them the words are quietly dissolving. And Rome, distracted by its own crises, by civil wars and barbarian invasions, and a treasury that could no longer pay for marble and bread and games, forgot that the Library of Alexandria needed feeding. But the scrolls remained, for a while longer, 500,000 voices of the dead, still speaking in the dark to anyone who would listen. The slow death of the library was not the work of one man or one fire. It was the work of a world that no longer believed in what it stood for. By the 4th century of our era, Christianity had risen to power in the Roman Empire, and the new faith did not love the old learning. The temples of the old gods were closed, their priests dispersed, their rituals forbidden. The Mouseion, a shrine of the pagan muses, became an embarrassment, a monument to gods no one worshipped anymore. The scholars who had once walked its colonnades were replaced by monks who walked them in silence, men who had no use for Homer or Aristotle, who carried a single book and believed it contained everything worth knowing, and who looked on the endless shelves of the library the way a man might look on a room full of idols, with suspicion and a kind of pity. The old curriculum, the 7 liberal arts that the library had preserved and taught for centuries, came to be seen as a relic of a dead and sinful world, a temptation of the devils who had once disguised themselves as muses. In the year 391, the Patriarch Theophilus led a Christian mob against the temple of Serapis, the great Serapeum that housed the daughter collection of the library. The crowd surged up the temple steps with torches and iron bars, shouting the name of Christ over the dying name of the old god. The colossal wooden statue of Serapis, draped in robes and crowned with a modius, the grain measure that symbolized the wealth of the earth, was torn apart, its pieces dragged through the streets and burned in the theaters while the crowd cheered. The temple itself was dismantled stone by stone, its red granite columns toppled and carried off to build churches. What happened to the scrolls inside is one of the great silences of history. Some writers say they were destroyed in the riot. Others say the collection had already been moved or had already withered to nothing after decades of neglect. We do not know. We know only that the Serapeum, the second heart of the library, stopped beating that year, and that no one bothered to record what was lost. And then came Hypatia. She was the daughter of the mathematician Theon, the last great scholar of Alexandria, a woman who taught philosophy and mathematics in the city at the turn of the 5th century, the inheritor of a tradition that stretched back 700 years to the first librarians. She was famous, brilliant, admired by the Roman prefect Orestes and respected even by the patriarch Cyril, a woman who stood at the center of the city's intellectual life in an age that no longer had a center for such a life. She drove her chariot through the streets of Alexandria, lectured in the old manner, and refused to convert. In the year 415, a mob of Christian zealots, perhaps monks from the Nitrian desert, seized her in the street, dragged her into a church, and tore her to pieces with roof tiles, the tools of builders turned to the work of murder. Her murder is the moment the ancient world is said to have died, the instant the last light went out. After Hypatia, no one in Alexandria taught what she had taught, and the lights that had burned for 700 years finally guttered out, and no one lit them again. The hardest thing about the library is not its burning. It is that we will never know exactly what burned. The catalog, those 120 scrolls that listed every title, is gone, itself one of the losses it once recorded. The index of the ancient world is missing, and we are left to guess its contents from fragments, from quotations in later writers, from the occasional scroll dug out of the sands of Egypt, dried and brittle and half-eaten by worms, still legible after 2,000 years because the desert preserves what the city destroyed. But even from the fragments, we can feel the shape of the loss, the way you can feel the shape of a building from its rubble. We know the library held the full archives of the city of Athens, the state records that recorded every treaty, every law, every theatrical performance, every ship launched, the memory of a democracy set down in ink. Gone. We know it held the complete works of the Greek comic poets, the hundreds of plays of Aristophanes and his rivals, of which only a handful survive, the rest lost to a fire that no one lit on purpose and no one could put out. We know it held the writings of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the first men in the West to argue that the world was made of atoms, of numbers, of water, of fire, the founders of a way of thinking that would take 2,000 years to be born again. Almost all of it is gone. We know it held the books of the great scientists, the engineers of the school of Alexandria, the men who built working steam engines and water clocks and screw pumps, and who understood the principles of levers and pulleys 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution, men whose machines were toys in their own time and would have been miracles in ours. Their manuscripts survived into the early Middle Ages and then vanished, eaten by damp, by fire, by indifference. We know it held the medical writings of Herophilus and Erasistratus, who dissected the human body and named its parts, and whose work was so controversial that later generations, horrified by the idea of cutting the dead, destroyed it, and with it the best map of the human body the ancient world ever made. We lost the complete text of Aristotle, of which only a quarter survives, the rest gone, the lectures and the dialogues and the finished works, the voice of a man who tried to classify everything the mind could touch. We lost most of the Greek historians, the chroniclers of the ancient world whose voices would have told us everything we do not know about the rise and fall of empires, the lives of kings, the names of the dead. We lost the maps. The library held the maps of the ancient world, the charts of trade routes and coastlines that had been drawn by sailors and travelers over centuries, the accumulated geography of a world that had taken 1,000 years to explore. All gone. And we lost the books we do not even know we lost, The works whose authors are names without faces, whose titles are not even recorded in the fragments that survive. Books that burn so completely that even their absence is invisible. The library was a window onto 600 years of human genius, and the window was shattered. What came through the cracks is what we call the classics, a handful of survivors from a wreck the size of a continent. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single night by a single villain. That is the myth, the clean story we tell ourselves because the truth is harder to face. The truth is worse. It died over centuries, in 1,000 small acts of indifference, in fires set by generals who did not know what they were burning, in mobs led by bishops who did not care, in budgets cut by emperors who had other wars to fight, in the slow failure of a civilization to remember why it had ever cared about a building full of old scrolls. The greatest loss in human history was not a catastrophe. It was a slow surrender, a long, quiet forgetting, the sound of a civilization letting go of the thing that had made it a civilization. And that is the lesson, the thing we should be most afraid of. Knowledge does not vanish in flames. It vanishes the moment we stop believing it is worth protecting. It vanishes when the scribes set down their pens and do not come back, when the librarians stop knowing what is on the shelves, when the city decides that a temple to old gods is an embarrassment and a lecture hall is a waste of marble. The scrolls of Alexandria are gone, burned and rotted and scattered, but the instinct that built them is not. Every library, every archive, every server farm that holds the work of the human mind is a child of that first great collection on the shore of the Mediterranean, a promise renewed that what we know will not die with us. So if this story moved you, if the thought of a million voices silenced makes you ache, then do something about it. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Leave a comment telling me which lost book you would most want to find, which silenced voice you would most want to hear again. Because the past is never as dead as we think, and somewhere, in the sands of Egypt, in a monastery cellar, in a forgotten drawer, in a hard drive no one has opened in years, another scroll is waiting to be read.